Hey guys, welcome back. So now with absolute carnage, which has already started and which will likely cause critical damage to the Marvel Universe as we know it, I feel like it's pretty important that I go back and cover a few points from like Cult of Carnage and some of Carnage USA, and hopefully give you guys a better understanding of some of the things that we'll likely see callbacks to throughout absolute carnage. So now if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch us spills every week, and don't forget to hit that bell up top so we can squat up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so now getting into the Cult of Carnage and doing this at a point in time where absolute carnage has just begun, I actually want to start this off by going back as far as Carnage Volume 4, and with doing so, I want to point out a few things that I believe Donny Cates is using to ground absolute carnage even deeper into his pre-existing history. But starting here with Gerry Conway's run of Carnage, it's here that we'd seen Conway tie a couple things to Carnage, which had been existing in Marvel Comics since like your early 70s, mid 70s, with relics like the Darkhold, which is a book of spells, which is also known as your book of sins, and we'll get a little bit deeper into that in just a little bit. But it was in Conway's run of Carnage back in 2015 when we had seen a direct connection between Carnage and the Darkhold, with this book holding a prophecy stating that the Red Slayer, he would spill blood and awaken the one who sleeps. And at the time, much of this was referencing towards the dark god Chthon, whom Carnage did eventually awaken using the book. But one of the most important things about the Darkhold is first that the spells in the Darkhold, they were all originally spells were founded by Chthon, who was also your first to study dark magic since like the dawn of man. But the collection of all his studies and all his spells and the scrolls that he had written throughout the ages, they had eventually been put together and they formed the book called the Darkhold. And many would use the accumulation of Chthon's studies to fulfill their own desires, like Vittorio Montesi, who couldn't have children, so then he used the book to make his wife pregnant, and that's how we got Victoria Montesi. But as it turned out through the years, we found out that much of what was in the Darkhold, much of it had been lost in chains and translation, and just enough to the point where it was still effective, but much of the accuracy was questionable. And much of this had to do with Chthon's studies being passed down through a number of different people, and it's been speculated that much of it has been misinterpreted over the course of millions of years. And it's likely this may have been the case with Chthon placing himself at the center of everything, because he was the first student of dark magic as an elder god, but not the creator. But throughout the course of Gerry Conway's run on Carnage, which had taken place before Marvel Legacy, and before we got any of the new history with Knull, the god of the symbiotes, but back during this time during the series, we had continually seen a symbol that had been associated with the Darkhold and this hidden cult who worshipped the Red Slayer, who had been prophesied to awaken him that sleeps. And that same pattern, and I'm sure you may have guessed it by now, as it so happens, it's the same symbol of Knull. And this we had seen back in 2015 with this location that Claire Dixon and Eddie Brock had stumbled across, to where its main entry was a staircase which was made in the same pattern as what we know now as a symbol of Knull. But at the time, this cult had used the staircase to hide their underground temple, to where on the surface they had used an old church as a cover-up for them to enter here to gain access underground. But during that event when Jubilee, or Jubilily, whichever, but she absorbed the toxin symbiote, which at the time was being used by Eddie Brock, used it to take down Chthon, who was still in a weakened state, being that he had just awoken. But at this time, she had also had help from Victoria Montesi, who used the Darkhold to amplify Jubilee's powers. But when this happened, the symbol that we had seen so often within the underground temple, it had only appeared on Carnage's chest, and strangely enough not appearing on Chthon, but only appearing on Carnage. But another thing that was new here for Carnage that we hadn't seen with any other symbiote is that because of the Darkhold, he was also able to create other symbiotes that he could control. And though the Darkhold itself isn't a new concept at this time, this was. Because prior to this point, when a symbiote broke off from another one, that new piece then took on a mind of its own. That's how we got Carnage from Venom, that's how we got Toxin from Carnage, so on and so forth. But after Carnage had been introduced to the Darkhold, after he had spilled his blood on it, then the new symbiote that he would create would take hold of whoever else he would want it to, but he could still control them after that. And granted, there was a time or two where he had some performance issues, to where this didn't exactly work as planned, and part of that had to do with some people who could just actually resist it, and the rest is said to be the Darkhold making the decision of who Carnage could or couldn't control. But I will also say that prior to this point, we have seen other writers play with this concept, because at a point in time heading into Secret Invasion and heading into Siege, Cletus Cassidy, who was locked away on the raft, which is like your supervillain prison, he had later escaped from the raft, but then the Sentry was like not so fast, flew him into space and ripped him in half, and mainly because that's the Sentry's signature move, just ripping people in half. But not long after this, when the symbiote was recovered, to which it would later rebond with Cletus Cassidy, but with the discovery being made by Michael Hall, he attempted to integrate the symbiote with technology to design advanced prosthetics. But also around this time, it was the first time we had actually seen the actual implementation of Carnage being able to control any other symbiote that spawned off of him. And at the time, it was said to be a product of Hall's experimentation, but at the time, that's as far as the explanation would go. But with Carnage having this new ability, this is what pretty much led into Carnage USA, which is like your short time where Carnage pretty much had taken over the small town of Doverton, Colorado, and really just claiming it for his own territory, and doing so by copying himself onto every man, woman, and child and animal in that small town. And this then led to Captain America putting together a small team to take care of the situation, and at the time it was just Wolverine, Hawkeye, The Thing, and Spider-Man, only because they were the closest heroes to that location. But when they arrived, all of them ended up getting under the influence of Carnage except for Spider-Man. But this ended up later being resolved by your Mercury team, who were pretty much like your symbiote soldiers, very similar to what we've seen in the most recent run of Venom. But with Spider-Man getting a bit of help from these guys, with the addition of Scorn and Flash Thompson, they were eventually able to stop Carnage. But upon the conclusion of this event, Flash had handed Cletus over to Captain America, and Scorn had taken the symbiote into her own possession, and that's where it all pretty much ended from there. But so now where all of this comes into relation for the cult of Carnage, which as I mentioned before ties very closely to Carnage Born, which tells us how Carnage came back from Venomized, but it's here in the cult of Carnage where we get more of your connective tissues to like the history of Carnage that we've talked about through the first part of this video, and it connects a lot of that to the awakening of Knull. And so now with Cult of Carnage taking place like months after Carnage USA, when Misty Knight was sent to Doverton in order to find John Jameson, the son of J. Jonah Jameson, who had went missing throughout the course of Carnage USA. And so now for those who may not know, John Jameson, the son of J. Jonah Jameson, he's the werewolf known as Man-Wolf. And long story short, on a trip to the moon, he encountered the Godstone, which transformed him into the Man-Wolf. And during Conway's run on Carnage, we also found out that there was some connection between Carnage and the Man-Wolf, though it was unspecified whether it was the Godstone itself or whether it traced back to something written in the Darkhold. Like at the time, we just weren't given a definitive answer. But for a brief moment where they were both depowered near the underground temple, Carnage did mention that they shared more similarities than they both had thought. But going back to Doverton, just months after Carnage USA, when Misty arrives here and she finds John, he of course doesn't remember much of the events that happened during Carnage USA. And over the course of time, some of his memory comes back to him, but the memory loss is just normal to his transformation, like he doesn't remember what happens when he transforms into Man-Wolf. But as his memories come back, we come to find out that not long after Carnage USA, someone had come back and removed the bodies who had been taken over by Carnage and also the Venom symbiote during that event as well. And yes, during that time, we had a gorilla Venom for a while, like it was crazy. But also with these removed bodies, they come to find out that the spines are ripped out as well. But while looking through some of the aftermath with Misty Knight, he begins to recall some of his memories from a couple days back when he met the town's former sheriff, Eric Morrell. And at the time with Morrell discovering the bodies dug up from the graves, his suspicions led him towards the Church of Greater Darkness. And if for no other reason, it's because it was called the Church of Greater Darkness, like hello. And like aside from the symbol of Knull on the front of the building, it just looks like they hypnotizing people in there. But the even wilder thing is, as obvious as this place seemed, Morrell and Jameson couldn't get in without an issued warrant. And even stranger than that, you weren't allowed in unless you were a member, which is weird because how do you become a member unless you visit a church? I mean, I ain't trying to go there, I'm just asking for a friend. But back at this time, following up with his suspicions, Jameson went to see the church's spokeswoman, who was Miss Deal, and when asking her about the strange symbols that he had seen everywhere, she was surprisingly open about it. And she was just like, oh yeah, that's a sign of Knull, Knull is God, and God is coming. But even still, after speaking with Miss Deal, this conversation couldn't get him through the front door, not without a warrant. So he just told her he'll be back in the morning with Morrell and a warrant. But later that night, something just didn't sit right with Jameson, just knowing that these people were probably playing Pokemon with people's spines. So in the middle of the night, he goes down there to investigate for himself and really feeling the urgent need to do so immediately because Eric was missing. And when he broke into the church, which he had also noticed had glowing lights coming from it, which was like a crazy giveaway. But when he arrives here, he finds Eric pleading for his help in the center of a number of the members of the town who had once again been taken over by Carnage. And when Jameson arrives here, the first of the three that are like at the head of this cult who reveals themselves to him is Shriek, who's also the first to make her attack on Jameson by yelling her name to him and throwing him across the room. And so now the second of these three, being Carnage, makes it pretty obvious who he is as he begins to cover Eric Morrell with his symbiote, which quickly takes over his body, straight up Carnage USA all over again, and with doing so completely taking Eric under. And throughout Jameson's scattered memories of that night, he remembers numerous moments of transforming into the Man-Wolf, but with doing so, this Carnage-like version of Eric attacking him, and doing so even to the point of where Jameson was covered with the Carnage symbiote for a moment in time. And though these memories are coming back to Jameson piece by piece, he doesn't necessarily share them with Misty Knight, especially to the point of what he had seen, especially after the third figure had stepped down shortly after and ripped out Eric's spine, and that third person of course being Doppelganger. But so now with this taking place so close to Carnage USA, we're given the indication that this has happened before Venomized, and it pretty much gives us the place of origin of this cult prior to Carnage Born, which is when we find out that Scorn, who had taken the Carnage symbiote from Carnage USA, she had also been a part of this cult as well. But much of this plays once again into the notion of what we've seen before, with Carnage not only putting his influence on others with his symbiote, but also his lasting influence like on Scorn, his symbiote offspring, who collected him prior to this event and then did the same thing later on after Venomized when she had taken his body from the Maker. But as it turns out, with Jameson only sharing some of this with Misty Knight, we come to find out as they leave Doverton that the influence of Carnage still has a hold on Jameson, and very likely for the purpose of what we talked about before, with Carnage building an army to collect every codex from everyone who has ever worn a symbiote, or perhaps even for just the purpose of being a spy. So now, the reason why this is important with this being with Jameson is because with everything that's been going on within the War of Realms and the new forming of the Agents of Wakanda, John Jameson has recently joined the Agents of Wakanda. And so because of this, in the case of any information that Carnage would need throughout Absolute Carnage, he would be able to source that from Jameson, because at this point he's pretty much subconsciously a double agent. But that'll do it for this one, guys. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, because though Cult of Carnage is bringing back a lot of the old history and lining it up with Carnage Born, to where Carnage Born shows us where Venomized and Venom Volume 4 fit in, like at this point we still have yet to see a definitive connection between Carnage and the Darkhold, but the returning characters and the symbols could be something to pan out to a much deeper meaning later on. But let me know what you guys think down in the comments, and we'll do it again on the next one. Alright, later.